Okay, here we go. So we are on Tzadi Gimel, all the way the last word on last words on 93A3. We are going to talk about Ner Tamas Bechitza today. That's the plan. Okay, I mean. Amar Rav Chisda, says Rav Chisda, and now we're on 93B1. Gidud Chamisha Mechitza Chamisha Emet Starfin. Elevation of 5 Tvachim and a partition on top of 5 Tvachim do not combine. Right, which is effectively right our mechitza. Right, in other words, not here, but the point is that you have elevate. So now we've been talking about mechitzas. You have 10 tvachim, right? You have 10 tvachim, a wall between. But now what the Gemara is talking about is a case where it is elevated 5 tvachim, right, and then there's 5 tvachim which are a wall. So from the perspective of the people on the bottom, you have 10 tvachim, but from the perspective of the people on the top, all you have is 5 tvachim. You have less than 10 tvachim. Essentially, the Gemara is questioning what happens when on one side of the mechitza you don't have 10 tvachim. It's just from the perspective of the people down below, there are 10 tvachim, right? Which is essentially what's taking place next door. So what Rav Chisda says, it's no good. He says it's no good. Should we stop here? Okay. So Rav Chisda says that is not a mechitza, right? He says achiu okula begitud, unless the whole thing is elevation, meaning you just have an elevation of 10 tvachim, that would be good. Okula mechitza, or entirely a partition, but mixing the two together, having a platform and then a mechitza on top of it, that is not good. Yeah.
What's the context that this is
being discussed over here? Excellent question. Okay, so we're going to, because the Gemara is ultimately going to come up with mention something as part of the discussion, which is relevant to, which is entirely relevant to our discussion, but it starts off in a place that is not relevant at all. Okay, Meisei, the Gemara questions this principle of Rav Chisda. So again, Rav Chisda walk into our shul, he'd say, nope, can't work. It has to be 10 tvachim high or a 10 tefach platform, but 5 tvachim, meaning partial platform, partial wall, that does not work. Meisei, the Gemara challenges this from a brisa. Shtei chatzeros zolim ala mizu. Brisa says there are 2 chatzeros courtyards side by side, and one is above the other. Okay, okay, and the upper one is 10 tvachim higher than the lower one. Okay, so case number 1 is your classic case we've seen until now. You have a ground floor, you have a courtyard, and then you have a 10 tefach wall, and on top of that wall a mound, and on top of that mound you have another courtyard. Fine, that is a good case. However, the brisa continues. Oshi yeshba gidud chamisha umechitza chamisha. Let's say the upper one has an elevation of 5 tvachim and a partition on top of that of 5 tvachim. Okay, so for example, look at diagram A, right? Or diagram C, probably, diagram C, right? So it's elevation of 5 and a partition of 5, and the Gemara says, Ma'arvin shnayin ve'em arvin echad. The Gemara says there are 2 separate chatzeros, and therefore you have 2 Eruvs. The people on the bottom in diagram C and the people on top in diagram C would not be able to join in one Eruv. There would be 2 separate Eruvs. So what does that tell you? That means there are 2 distinct places, that it is a good wall, right? That's what the Gemara is saying. The Gemara is saying, the Brisa says in diagram C that you cannot join them as one, meaning it is a full-fledged wall, which Rav Chisda just told us it is not a full-fledged wall, right? And then the Brisa continues, and we'll keep these words in mind, we'll come back to them. Pachos mikan, if the partition is less than 10 tvachim, so let's say, what it sounds like what we're saying right now is, let's say the wall on top, the second wall, there's the platform of 5 and then the wall of 5. Let's say it's a wall of 4. Then Ma'arvin echad ve'em arvin shnayim. Then they could join in one. They have to, if they want to make an eruv, they have to join in one, because there's no longer a 10 tefach partition, 10 tefach, a gap between the both of them. Okay, but the bottom line is diagram C is diametrically opposed to what Rav Chisda told us. The Brisa is telling us that diagram C, you make 2 eruvs because it is a full-fledged wall of 10 tefachim between them. Yeah. So Gemara says like this. Amar Rava gives an answer. Mod Rav Chisda b'tachtona. Rav Chisda says, in regards to people on the bottom, it is a valid partition. In other words, until now we've been assuming that it's going to be consistent. If it's not a good wall, it's not a good wall. But now he's saying, no. From the perspective of the people down below, meaning like in our shul, from the perspective of the men, it's a good mechitza, because there's 10 tvachim from the perspective of the floor, right? And therefore, hol v'ro pnei asara, since he's C10, okay? However, from the perspective of the people on the top one, right? From the perspective of the people on the top one, it is not going to be a good eruv, right? And the perspective of the people on top, it's not going to be a good wall, and that's why you're going to have to combine. Okay, so the Gemara says, right? So in other words, what the Gemara is trying to answer at this point is saying that, look, really Rav Chisda is right. Really, it is not a good wall in the sense that it's not a good wall. But from the perspective of the people on the bottom, it would be a good partition. From the perspective of the people on top, it would not be a good partition. Ask the Gemara, Ihachi, if that is the case, that it is a valid partition for the people on the bottom, tachtona ta'arev shnayim, v'lo ta'arev echad. Okay, the people on the bottom are allowed to make their own eruv and don't have to go ahead and join in a common eruv. Alyona lo ta'arev lo echad lo shnayim. However, the people on the top are not allowed to go ahead and join in a separate one or a common one. Okay, what that means is as follows. The Brisa said in a case where there is 10, the Brisa is like this. When there is a platform of 5 and a wall of 5, the Brisa said they each make their own eruv. Now, according to what Rava's saying no. Really what that means is the people on the bottom are allowed to make an eruv, and the people on top cannot make an eruv, right? In other words, let me say this better. Rav Chisda says when you have 5 platform and 5 wall, it is not a good wall. It's not a good wall. In other words, what we have next door is not good. Right? The Gemara says, what are you talking about? We have a Brisa which says it is good. So the Gemara says, no. It's good from the perspective of the people on the bottom. Those people can make their own eruv, but they can't join together, right? Those people make their own eruv because they have a good wall. They can make a good wall. Fine. Right? So then, one second. Yeah, so therefore it is a good wall, and therefore the people on the bottom are able to make their own eruv and not join together with the people on the top. The problem is the Brisa doesn't say that. The Brisa says that when there is this type of wall, then the Brisa says the people on the upper chatzar are allowed to form their own eruv. Right? That's what the Brisa said. The Brisa said, in the case of a platform, not only the men are allowed to make their own eruv, the women can make their own eruv. Right? I'm going to use that as our source.
We're talking about chatzar.
Talking about chatzar.
So I'm trying to remember the specifics, but if you can't do an eruv on the upper portion, then it should invalidate the eruv on the other side because they're in a chatzar that is open to each other, at least from one perspective, and therefore they have to either be in the eruv together or not. Right? So it would be a problem if the people who are in the one where the lower one.
No, we have cases like that. We have that. I mean, that's literally our Mishnah's case, which we're going to come back to. In other words, you have a case where it's open on one side, right? It's 3 walls on one side, and from the other perspective, with respect to the bigger chatzar, you have cases where it's 4 walls, right?
Oh, so we're gonna. Well, but in this case,
that's our case.
But on both sides, there's.
No, from the perspective of the people on the bottom, it's a full-fledged mechitza. Good, but that's exactly where we're going. Okay, fine. So again, the Gemara at this point, Rav Chisda says our mechitza next door is no good. Okay, and then the problem is the Brisa tells us, the Brisa says explicitly that such a wall is good, right? So Rava has to say for Rav Chisda, what he means is that it's a good mechitza for the people on the bottom. That the people on the bottom can therefore make their own eruv. From the perspective of the people on the top, it's not a good eruv. The Gemara says if that's the case, but the Brisa doesn't say that. The Brisa says that they could both make their own eruv, implying that it's both good for the people in the men's section and the people in the women's section. So Amar Rav Bar Ula, so Gemara has to make an ukimta, has to suggest we're talking about a very particular case. Kigon shahaisa alyona migu pefes ad eser amos. We have to assume, like diagram D, that what we're talking about, the reason that the Brisa says in such a case that they could each make their own eruv is because in addition to the 10 tfachim, 5 of the platform, 5 of the wall, there is also like a door, like side walls. Look at diagram D, where there's side walls, and what that creates is an addition, right? Meaning, what happens when you have partitions on each side? It's like the beginning of a doorway. It's essentially seen as a doorway, and therefore, even though it's not covered throughout, it's seen as like an entire wall. And therefore, what the Gemara is saying is that since we're assuming now, we're adding that there are an extra 5 tfachim height of wall on each side of this wall. Therefore, what you have is actually 10 tfachim of wall, and that's why the Brisa said that in this case, in diagram D, they each make their own eruv. Yeah, you with me? Yes. Okay. Let's make sure we're all on the same page. Again, the Brisa is talking about a case where there is platform of 5 tzvachim, and then there is wall of 5 tzvachim. Right? The Brisa said in this case, right, this platform, this is wall. Yeah, makes sense. Okay, and there's a house over here. House over here. Houses. Okay, houses. Fine. Doors. Fine. The bottom line is the Brisa said in this case, you could go ahead and make 2 eruvs. The problem is, according to Rav Chisda, you shouldn't be able to make 2 eruvs because this is not a good wall. So the Gemara says, what we meant is that it's a good wall for these people. The Gemara says, but that's not what the Brisa says. The Brisa says it's good for both people. So he says, you're right. What we have over here is, and this is not going to work now. I'm going to make a front picture.
Yeah, just do it between, like you give a little down. In between the house and the wall, you got something else.
No, okay, it's fine. So basically now we're looking at it from the front view. I'm sorry, Murray, can you see? Then we have the wall. Sorry? You got the picture. It's fantastic. You got the wall. Okay, 5 tvachim, 5 tvachim. So again, Rav Chisda was saying it's not good, but now we're adding this. We're adding this. Okay, of 5 tvachim, and this is essentially a doorway. And so really, you have 10 tvachim of wall. Good. Now we understand what the Brisa said, that they can each go ahead and they each make their own eruv. The problem is, which we're about to see, is the Brisa also said that if it is less than 10 tvachim, let's say it is now less than 10 tvachim, right? Now I just made that 9 tvachim, right? Which means that this is now also going to be only 9 tvachim. What did the Brisa say? Yachim Asefa, Pachos Mikan, Ma'arvin Echad, Ve'marvin Shnayim. Sorry. No. It's different. Sorry. If the partition, how are we doing this? 1 second. So what we're going to do is we're going to say if this wall, the partition is going to be less than 10 tvachim, but it's still going to reach up to 10 tvachim. But let's say now the partition is now, if you're measuring over here, it's only 2 tvachim, right? And what do the Brisa say in this case? It's not a good wall. But why not? Because once you have these things added, right, then really it is a good wall. It's just there's a doorway there, right? So that's what Gemara is going to ask now. For the end of the Brisa said, if it's less than 10 tvachim, the partition now is going to be 2 tvachim. Then you only make 1 erev, you don't make 2. But why is that so? If they want, there's a doorway now. Anytime you have a doorway, what do? If there's a doorway between 2 chatzeros, then they have the choice. You could either join them together, or you could have 2 separate erevs. So Gemara says, 93b2, Amarava Breja Rava, Kigon Shenifrata Tachtona Bimloa Le'Elyona. And this comes back to the case that Max that you touched upon, and that is now we're saying the case is actually like diagram F. Okay, with diagram F is where the people on the lower chutzner are entirely open to the people on the upper chutzner. Okay, and therefore that what's going on now is that until now we've assumed that this doorway is apparent on both sides. Right? It's apparent on both sides. But now we're saying, and I have absolutely no way of drawing this, I'm not going to bother, but if you look at diagram F, what it shows is that the people on the bottom, they don't have a wall. They don't have a wall, right? And therefore, what we're forced to do is that when it's less than 10 tvachim high, then they are forced to go ahead and join in 1 eruv, right? Because at the end of the day, the people on the bottom only have 3 walls. They do not have any parts. Had those side parts gone into the common area, right? Had those side posts gone into the common area between the bottom people and the top people, then you'd be able to either make their own eruv. Then you're right, they could each make their own eruv. The reason that you can't do so is because the people on the bottom have no walls on the fourth side, and therefore you have to make 1 eruv together. Okay? Ihachi, the Gemara asks, Tachtona chad ta'arev trei lo ta'arev. Okay, so if that's so, then the people on the bottom should be able to join in a common eruv with the upper ones, but not in its own one, right? In other words, the people on the bottom, from their perspective, they are connected to the people on the top. Elyona, ibais trei to arev, ibai chad to arev. The people on the top could have a choice, since from their perspective, they are walled in, but they have a doorway. When you have a doorway, what's the halacha? When I have a doorway from one courtyard to another, I have a choice. I could either make my own eruv, or I could join with the other eruv. Okay? Fine. And yet the Brisa said that neither of them can make their own eruv. They have to join together as one. So Gemara says, you're right, they could. The Gemara says, you're right. When the Brisa said that if it's lower, then you make then you have to join in one, then you join in 1 eruv, and they're not allowed to join in 2 separate eruvs. That's referring to the people on the bottom. But from the respect of the people on the top, you would be allowed to make an eruv together. You'd be allowed to make an eruv just the people on the top. So bottom line is the Brisa is not able to be a question on Rav Chisda's approach, and Rav Chisda is with the opinion that if you were to walk into our shul, he would say, no good. It has to be either 10 tvachim, and there has to be a balcony of 10 tvachim, or it has to be a wall of 10 tvachim. But if it's a mix of the both, it would not work. Okay? The Gemara is not done though. Tarish Mereimar disagrees. Gidud chamisha ve'mechitza chamisha mitzdarfin. He says elevation of 5 tvachim, partition of 5 tvachim do combine. Okay, fine. The Gemara says, Ashke Ravina, he argues and says it does combine. The mechitza over here is good. Ashke Ravina lo Rav Acha, Bereda Rava Amrle, Ravina met Rav Acha, the son of Rava, and says, Tani Mar Midim Mechitza, did the master teach anything regarding the validity of such a partition? Amrle, in other words, he was coming back from yeshiva, and he said, did you learn anything in yeshiva about such a partition? Amrle lo, he said, no, nothing was taught. The Gemara now concludes this discussion. Everyone can rest assured that our mechitza is good. The halacha is that 5 platform and 5 partition, even though from the perspective of the women's section, i.e. the people on the balcony, it is not 10 tvachim, but since from one perspective it is 10 tvachim, it is a full-fledged wall, and that is where the Gemara lands. Okay?
They don't give
For both sides.
From both sides, right? But in other words, as long as it's a good wall from one side, we treat it as a wall from. The idea of a partition is something which is relevant to separating between two sides, right? So in other words, as long as you say from one side it's separated, then you can't, right? As long as there's separation from one side, that means there is separation, and therefore from both sides it is valid. That's the rationale also. Okay.
Sometimes they spell it out, other times they don't even give.
Yeah, they don't spell it out.
They give the halacha here also, which sometimes we just leave it on its own.
Correct. Okay, new discussion, which we've touched upon a number of times before. Bayer of Ohoshia asked the following question. Let's say residents come on Shabbos, does it cause prohibition? In other words, what that would mean is as follows. Let's say you have courtyards, you have two courtyards, courtyard over here, they have a wall between them, they each made their own Eruv, and then on Shabbos the wall falls down between them. So now it's like new people came on Shabbos, right? Because now all of a sudden you have people from courtyard B who are connected to courtyard A, even though when Shabbos started they were totally separate and they didn't make a common Eruv. So is it now going to cause a prohibition since they never made an Eruv together? Yeah? Got the case? Okay. Amr Chisda Tashma Chatzar Gedolish Nifrit Tana. We have our Mishnah. Our Mishnah said a large courtyard that was breached into a smaller one. Okay? Hagdol Muteres, the people in the large one, right? Our case, the case we've been talking about until now, of the big courtyard, right? And then you have the small courtyard, and and we said these guys are allowed to carry, these guys are not allowed to carry. And the terminology of the Bryce of the Mishnah was that a big one that broke shenifritza liktana, that if something broke between them. In other words, it sounds like initially there was a wall, but then the wall broke down. Right? So the Gemara tries to say, right? So Agdola Muteres Vaktana Surah Neshu Pischa Shel Gedola. The people in the large one are allowed to carry, the people in the small one are not allowed to carry because the big one have the big one, it's like an entrance. Fine. Amarabba, Amar Mibod Yom Nifritza. Who says? Why are you assuming that the Brisa said the Mishnah was referring to a case where it broke on Shabbos? In which case it would be a proof that if it falls on Shabbos, then it doesn't impact anything. Say that if broke on Friday. Say that it broke on Friday. Amalei Abaye says, Lo tema mar amar. Okay, so Abaye pushes back on Rabbah. He says, don't be so polite. Don't say, maybe it broke on Shabbos. Maybe it broke before Shabbos. Say that our Mishnah is referring definitely to a case where it broke before Shabbos. Why? Damar da Amar, because you yourself once said, and we saw this about 80 blot ago, by my name Rav Huna, that you told us that you asked Rav Huna, uvay my name Rav Yehuda, and you asked Rav Yehuda, Erev Derech HaPesach, if two courtyards made an Erev by an entrance, okay, meaning let's say you have two courtyards side by side and there's a doorway, there's a window between them, okay, which is a portal. So what do we say? If there's two courtyards side by side and there's a window between them, they have a choice. They can make an Erev, they're allowed to make an Erev together. And they did make an Erev together, right? So again, classic case, you have two courtyards, courtyard number one, courtyard, and there's like a little opening over here, courtyard number two. They have a choice. They can make an Erev together. And let's say they chose to make an Erev together. There's one big Erev joining the two of them together, and then on Shabbos, something happens, and this gets closed off. Okay? There's U.S. drops a nuke, and basically the opening gets closed. Okay? Sorry. Fine. So, Erev Derech Pesach, Nisma Pesach, the entrance becomes sealed. Erev Derech alone, or they made a Erev by a window. V'nistam alone, the window gets sealed. Mahu, what's the halacha? Are you allowed to still carry from one courtyard to another? Okay? Fa'amrli, Shabbos came in Shutra Hutra. Once it started on Shabbos in a certain way, it stays permitted on Shabbos. Okay, so the point is that what we see over here is that once Shabbos starts in a certain way, it stays consistently in that fashion, right? You said it explicitly to us, and that's that's the question over here. Do we look at the way something starts on Shabbos, or do we say that it could change on Shabbos, or do we, right? In other words, again, we're talking about Eruvin, which is a rabbinic law, and the question is, when Shabbos starts in a certain way, do we say regardless of what happens over Shabbos, we leave it, okay? And so the Gemara over here is suggesting that based on this discussion that it's however something started on Shabbos, that's how we leave it, and even if the details change, even if the doorway gets closed between them, it doesn't matter. We're still allowed to carry between them. Yeah.
Does it make a difference that the people who are coming are not people who live there?
No, it doesn't seem like the Gemara is distinguishing between the two.
Because we had it where they live there, they're not.
Correct. Gemara doesn't seem to me. Right.
You just say, if you don't live there, just don't come in.
Yeah, that's very pragmatic, but let's say they do. They don't always listen. Yeah, so it's Mar. Okay, now we're going to wrap up this discussion. Let's say you have a wall between two courtyards, our case, and it collapses. Rav Amar a metaltalin bo el arba amos. Rav says that once the wall falls down, and now they are not merged together. These two courtyards never made an Eruv together. So Rav says that you're not allowed to carry. In other words, you only allowed to carry 4 amos, meaning you're not allowed to carry. Shmuel disagrees and says, we're at 94a1, Again, he says you're allowed to carry up to the wall. Again, so this is the case. It's a case where this little, I don't know if you can see, right? Let's say this case, they did not make an Eruv because there was a full-fledged wall between them, right? They made an Eruv on their own, they made an Eruv on their own, and now on Shabbos there is an earthquake and this falls down. So Rav says, well, you don't have a wall, and they never made an Eruv, and therefore Rav says, no way, you both can't carry, right? And because at the end of the day, they're now all together. And Shmuel says, no, since they made an Eruv before, they each allowed, you pretend there's a wall over here, and they're each allowed to carry until that point, okay? Fine. Says the Gemara, V'hadza Rav. Now Gemara just tells us that the Rav said that you're not allowed to carry. La b'ferish itbar was never said explicitly. El miklala itbar, it was inferred from a story. In other words, Rav never said these words explicitly. It was inferred from a story. What's the story? Rav and Shmuel have a yasba hu chadzer. Rav and Shmuel were sitting together in a courtyard on Shabbos. Okay, and on the courtyard they were sitting in had an Eruv. There was another courtyard adjacent to it which had their own Eruv, but there's a wall between them. And then on Shabbos, Nafal Guda de Beni Beni, the wall that stood between them fell down. Literally our case, okay? So, Amr Lu Shmuel said, Shkolu Galima Nigidu Bey. Okay, take a shawl and draw it across the place of the fallen partition. In other words, Shmuel said, go take a piece of clothing and put it over here. Put it over here, okay?
Meaning it's not good unless you put something back.
We'll see. Think about it. They're sitting over here. Let's say the courtyard. This is not to scale. Okay, this is a 100-foot courtyard, right? And Shmuel and Rav and Shmuel are sitting over here. Okay, this picture is getting tinier and tinier. And Shmuel says to one of his attendants, "Go take a piece of clothing and carry it all the way here." On the contrary, what does that tell us? He says you're obviously allowed to carry. Right? He's saying you're allowed to carry. And what happens? And Adrina Rav La'ape. Rav turned his face away. Okay, turn his face away is implying that he did not think it was allowed, right? By turning his face away, it was basically implying that's not a good idea. Shmuel said, "Ikapit Abba." If Abba, it's a term of endearment that he referred to his colleague Rav. If he has an objection, shkolu hem yanu b'kitzur bey. Take his belt and fasten the shawl. What does he mean? He says if he doesn't like it, force him to help out. Okay, this is classic rabbinic the barbs, back and forth between one another. In other words, Rav clearly was unhappy. Shmuel said, "Okay, he's unhappy. Good. Give us your belt so we can help fasten this piece of clothing." In other words, he was saying, "Sorry, too bad." Okay, so now the Gemara analyzed this. L'Shmuel lama liha. Why does Shmuel say you need to put this thing right? It's like Max was saying. It sounds like he's saying you do need to have a wall, and yet he's allowed to carry. You don't need to put a new wall up. Why is he asking for this? So Shmuel put this wall up just for privacy. In other words, you just have two courtyards open. It wasn't for halachic reasons. Shmuel holds you right. I'm fully allowed to carry, but he wanted to have privacy, and therefore he says put up this curtain. Okay, V'Rav Yisfir Dastir Lamale. If Rav held that it was really prohibited to carry the shawl, then why is he being so modest over here? He's just looking away. Say it's usher. Right? If you're sitting somewhere and someone's doing something usher, speak up. So why didn't Rav say it's usher? So answer to Shmuel Hava. It was in the place where Shmuel was the Rav. In other words, Rav was visiting Shmuel. It was Shmuel's city. It was Shmuel and Shmuel. Therefore, it wasn't appropriate for him to tell people to act differently because it was Shmuel's place. So he hachi my time adrina la'ape. Okay, so if he was in Shmuel's place, then why does he turn his face away at all? He should just say, okay, I'm in Shmuel's place, and therefore I should be quiet. So Mar says lo nemer k'Shmuel sfirle, because he was kind of stuck. On the one hand, he can't say don't go like that because it's Shmuel's place, and therefore he's going to default. If Shmuel's, if you're in someone else's home and they have a different psak, you're in a Sephardi's home, you don't say, oh, you're doing the wrong thing. That's the thing. But the problem is Rav is a big rabbi, and if he just says, okay, let's it go, then what's going to happen? A year from now, this question is going to come up again. I'll say, I was there, and Rav didn't say anything. Clearly, Rav was okay, and therefore Rav looks the other way as a way of kind of, indicating that he wasn't okay with it, but we couldn't full-throated say it wasn't good because in doing so, that would not be appropriate because he was in Shmuel's place. Okay, have a great day. Good Chodesh.